Good afternoon. So I want to welcome you to our talk on adversarial view of malware SaaS-based malware sandboxes. So who are we? So my name is Jason Trost. I'm VP of Threat Research at ThreatStream. I've worked in security for more than the past 10 years. Here's a few of the places I've worked: India, DoD, Booz Allen, in-game, and most recently. My background is mainly big data, analytics, security research, and also machine learning.
And I'm Aaron Schellmeyer. I came from the CERT and Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute. Before that, the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center and Bell Secure Works, and now I'm at ThreatStream. Most of my work has been in incident response, intrusion response, and analyzing the artifacts, whether that's malware analysis and such, to the host-based forensics and creating endpoint solutions and such.
You may want to hold the mics up for louder.
A little closer. That far away wasn't good enough? This is a little better? Yes. So when we were doing this, our motivation was we kept hearing a lot of different things about malware and how sandboxes don't work. We heard that earlier today in this room, actually. So we wanted to take a look at some of those things. One of those is that AAV is dead. We wanted to see, well, what happens with AAV? What happens when we submit a sample to a whole bunch of these different AAV vendors? What goes on there?
We also were curious how data samples submitted to these sandboxes and data that gets generated from them propagates through threat intelligence feeds and also data sharing programs. So how are the samples shared? How is the domains generated? How do they propagate to other threat intelligence feeds? Next thing you're interested in is operational security. So when you submit files to these places, are you going to tip off the adversary? What are they going to see? What are they going to know? What timeline are they going to know? That sort of thing.
We also kept, and whenever I've looked at a lot of different samples, you keep seeing malware that employs these new methods to detect the sandboxes that they're running in. We wanted to see if that worked and how advanced you had to be to actually detect the different sandboxes that people are using, at least the commercial and free implementations of those. So with our experiment, we created a sensor. And we created a couple versions of that sensor and submitted it to different sandboxes. On the server side, we just stood up a HTTP Tornado app and Bind DNS servers. And we encoded the execution time in the domain name that it looked up, as well as the campaign ID, so we could track which sandbox we submitted it to. We submitted it to 29 different sandboxes, well, 29 different samples to 29 different sandboxes, and then we watched the traffic roll back in. These are some of the sandboxes we submitted to. They included our own sandbox, because we wanted to see what happened when we ran things with our configuration. With our sensor, this is some of the information we brought back, and we just enumerate the host. We take a look at the socket-based, we use socket-based communications instead of WinINet, so there wouldn't be an index.dat entry. We created a run key and we deleted a run key. And we did that because we wanted to see the validity of the results that the sandboxes were returning to people, to see if they were monitoring everything or if they were just doing a snapshot before and after and comparing. And then we exited the process. There wasn't any remote access capability. It didn't allow you to download any files. It didn't allow you to have a reverse shell, anything like that.
Just to be clear, nothing that our sensor did was malicious in any way. So it's just enumerating the host and then communicating details about the host back to us for research purposes. So just wanted to be clear, but here's some of the details. So number of CPUs, username, process list of the currently running processes, the amount of RAM on the machine's local IP address, the machine's host name, the hard drives, all the drives, hard drives removable, and details about them, details about the BIOS, and then the MAC address. So literally this is all the sort of data we collected, really with the goal of kind of identifying features of malware sandboxes that are fingerprintable, just so we can do further research.
When we were building this, we wanted to make it kind of look like malware, though. And we tried to make it look like APT malware as much as possible. A lot of APT malware that you look at does a lot of that host enumeration that we did. And we also took a sample of malware from a family called WMI, if you're familiar. And we modeled our HTTP communications after them. This is the WMI communications. It uses this little packet bracket there and puts base64 encoded zlib compressed data. And then this was our HTTP traveler, which was zlib compressed and base64 encoded inside the packet captures. That worked pretty well, but we evolved our sample to do a little bit more.
So as we're going through this research, and we submitted our first kind of round of samples to all these different sandboxes, we noticed quite a few of the samples were getting executed, but we weren't seeing HTTP requests. So all we were seeing is DNS outbound, and we figured a bunch of these malware sandboxes were blocking TCP connections. So when that happened, all we could see is evidence of execution, but we could not see the details of the actual sandbox environment. So one of the goals was to see if we could determine really as widespread as possible those details. So the next thing that we did, we evolved our sensor, and we added a very simple DNS covert channel. So same sort of thing as before, we zlib compressed all the data that we were sending back. We hex encoded that, and we split it across chunks of DNS packets, really just doing simple multiple DNS A requests, and then capturing all that data on the remote side, and then decoding all of it.
So everyone keeps saying that AV's dead. You're not going to get any good detections from this. When we first submitted our samples, that was true. In the beginning, all of our samples were shown as being completely benign. We had 0 antivirus detections, which kind of we should have since it's not really malware. But over time, over about a month later, VirusTotal ended up with 6 of our samples that had been submitted to other sandboxes. And our antivirus detection ranged from 8 out of 57 engines to 30 out of 57 engines. Most of them noted our malware, or noted our sensor as being Zeus or Grafter. And one of the other interesting pieces of it was that as time went on, the amount of AV engines noting it as malicious increased.
So kind of part of this research's goal was to figure out how information propagates from these malware sandboxes really through the research community. So kind of first question, is sharing happening? I think everyone kind of knows that that happens, so the answer to that is yes, actually quite a bit of sharing is happening. So we found, because each sample submitted to each of these different sandboxes was unique and had its own unique campaign ID, we could track, well, we submit the sample here, but then we see all executed here, 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 and here over time. So some places we found would propagate the sample to about 10 other places and also execute the sample. So when that sample gets executed, it generates a ton of network traffic. You can see the vantage points where the network traffic came from. If they did an HTTP request, you can see the source IP of where the traffic came from. So we can see the DNS server and the source IP from all these different locations. A lot of these places also, I would say, were using very poor operational security. They were doing it from their own corporate network. Every major AV company was represented in our logs. So this kind of goes to show if you upload a sample to most of these sandbox servers or services, the data will get propagated to AV companies. You lose complete control over it. They will execute it, and they will likely do a lot more. The other things we found, because we encode the campaign ID and the timestamp of execution in the domain name, we would see samples get executed initially by the initial sandbox we submitted it to, and then over the course of weeks and days later, we'd see DNS resolutions coming in for the same exact domain names, which we knew were not from new executions, they were from old executions, which we could trace back. We could also see how basically the sharing of these domains is going on. And ultimately, some of the domains wound up on threat intelligence lists, which we thought was really interesting because this is not malware, it doesn't do anything malicious. It wasn't reported from a customer. We uploaded it as researchers. It propagated through the network of security researchers and made on some threat intelligence feeds. The other thing that we saw, a lot of the origins of the traffic, so both the direct connections to our C2 server and DNS resolutions came directly from the corporate networks of major AVs, as well as several security product companies. So just to reiterate, you submit a sample to one of these sandboxes, you lose complete control over it, you will be tipping off the adversary. We're going to show a lot more detail in the slides. So here's the domains that run up with the threat intelligence feeds. So just 3 of the feeds that we have access to, which we thought this was kind of interesting. So this is just a timeline of events. First domain, first DNS resolution observed. Soon after, we see an HTTP request, and that's just a few seconds apart. And then the following day winds up on the threat intelligence feed. Very similar with the next ones. DNS resolution observed, added to threat intelligence feed, and then later on we see an HTTP request, which this is a little curious. So there, 2 hours later, we saw the HTTP request associated with this. So I'm not sure if they are buffering or blocking these HTTP requests and doing them later, or in a very, very much delayed system, but we thought that was kind of interesting. And then similar pattern for the last one. So one other thing we did was taking a look at all the sandbox IPs, and this was just out of curiosity. We had tons of threat intelligence data, and then we have the sandbox IPs that are interacting with our system. So we just were curious, if you take these sandbox IPs and look them up in the threat intelligence databases, what comes out of it? So of all the sandbox IPs that made a valid post, so this means they're actually allowing HTTP or TCP connections outbound. 15 of them were also identified in some threat intelligence feeds. 6 of them were from Tor, so this shows that some of the sandbox vendors are actually routing their traffic through Tor. That's not a bad idea. It covers your tracks a little bit, and if you're running this out of your corporate network, it wouldn't identify you. 1 was an anonymous proxy, also probably not a bad idea. Hides who you are. All the others were kind of interesting because these sandboxes allow outbound TCP connections, there's avenues for abuse. So of all the other IPs identified, they're identified as bot IPs, so this a lot of times means they connected to someone's sinkhole, which is not surprising. On malware, there's a DNS resolution for a malicious domain that's been sinkholed by a researcher. That IP connects into a sinkhole, so that makes sense. Spam IPs, same sort of thing. They let outbound TCP connections go. Some amount of spam goes out, they get blocked, or they get added to a list. Brute force IPs, scanning IPs, very similar in nature. And then lastly, these were kind of interesting. So 2 of them showed up as compromised IPs. So one of them showed up as a victim in a Hawkeye keylogger log. Not surprising, but interesting nonetheless.
So as far as the timeline of activity here, we first submitted this stuff on a Friday, and a lot of places made DNS connections to us, and then just a few of us hit our C2 server. The more interesting thing was, on Monday morning, it seemed that everybody had their YARA roles uploaded to VirusTotal or something, and all of a sudden we had a large amount of HTTP requests to our HTTP server. The second submission, about, what was that, like maybe a month later, we received a lot of DNS requests again, but that made sense because we were using the DNS C2 during that time period. One of the other interesting things that were occurring were in the middle of the week, during the second week, we started to get a lot more DNS resolutions. We don't really know why that occurred. Maybe it was that this information had been uploaded to those portals and people would resolve those or try to scrape those different C2 or different sandbox portals at that point. But we received a lot more traffic during that time period. But one of the most interesting things occurred on the 25th of August. During that time period, there was a handful of IP vanish IPs that started hitting our HTTP server, and they were really obviously trying to enumerate vulnerabilities and directories on our server. And I think our server would respond to anything, correct? Yeah. So it was kind of interesting to see that. One of the other features that we wanted to enumerate here was, based upon all of the reporting of malware detecting sandboxes with these different advanced techniques, are those advanced techniques obfuscated on the sandboxes, or is it much easier to enumerate the different sandboxes?
So, like Aaron said, one of our goals was also to see, can we fingerprint the sandboxes? How hard is this? Do you need some of the more advanced techniques that have been talked about in academic and security research literature? So that's why we collected all that data that I mentioned earlier. So this is just kind of a listing of some of the stuff that we found, and I just kind of want to talk through it. So system process lists. A lot of times these malware sandboxes run over VMware. That's not surprising. That's not a dead giveaway of malware sandbox, but it can be an indication. I know a lot of enterprises are moving to using virtualized hosts, so you can't just rely on this, but we did definitely see a lot of this in this research. The MAC address, same sort of thing. If you take the MAC address, look up its OUI number and IEEE, and just look and see what vendor makes it. VMware was the most represented system that we found. So a lot of these malware sandboxes, also not surprisingly, are using VMware. There were a few others that also showed up. And some of these actually look like they were trying to cover their tracks, trying to make it look like it wasn't a virtualized system. Going down the list with BIOS, same sort of theme. VMware was the most popular. Box and QEMU were kind of interesting because they're both virtualization frameworks. They're both not extremely broadly used, at least in enterprises. So these are start to kind of get you closer to tell you this is probably a sandbox. Disk size, same sort of thing. How many people do you know have a 20 gig hard drive on their machine? I'd say probably not very many unless you're running a tablet. We did some market research, and you can still buy machines with small hard drives, but they're almost all tablets. The smallest that I could find was 32 gig. So all these very small hard drives are likely to be pretty anomalous in an enterprise setting. So if bad guys are submitting samples, or bad guys if they key in on disk size in the machine, this could be an indication that you're running in a sandbox, especially taken with this other criteria that we're talking about. RAM, same sort of thing. 1 gig of RAM was the most popular setting on all these systems. How many enterprise computers do you know run with just 1 gig of RAM? Maybe quite a few. Most systems we've seen come with 2 gigs. So this was also kind of telling.
We are in DC, so there's a lot of old corporate machines running around.
That's right. And then lastly, and this is also another interesting tell, was the exe renamed? So how often do you download something and then rename it to sample.exe, malware.exe, or take the MD5 of the sample and rename it to that before you run it? So this is, as a normal user who likely that's the target of malware, they're not going to do this. Researchers are going to do this. This was very, very prominent in almost every sandbox we looked at. Not every one of them, but most of them. So there's kind of a lot of tells. None of these are sophisticated, but taken in aggregate, you can really start to kind of zero in on, is this a sandbox or is this a user?
Yeah, and one other feature was the number of drives connected. Most virtualized hosts that people run, your Citrix, your VMware hosts in corporate environments will have multiple drives connected to them, even if they have that small fixed disk. So in our view, all of the things that malware authors are doing to try to detect sandboxes are way too advanced. You can detect the sandboxes much easier than that. If you just look at the CPU count and look for disk size smaller or equal to 60 gigs, and the other thing was none of the sandboxes were running a web browser. And pretty much everybody's computer is running a web browser these days. If you just look for those things, you will probably detect 90% of researchers' machines or sandboxes.
So one other thing I just wanted to kind of key in on. So we thought this was kind of interesting. So the number of sandboxes and these are diverse sandboxes. These are not the same ones where we submitted, across different campaigns that we did, had the same usernames, same host names, same disk size, same CPU count, pretty much very, very similar across the images. So what this tells us is people are sharing images. So they're taking a Windows image that's identical and they're just sharing it out. So this, from an operational security standpoint, is incredibly bad. This basically allows the bad guy to kind of zero in on what to look for. Am I in a sandbox? And you can tell with not a lot of effort if you're to do this sort of like data collection, really what to look for and how widely propagated these images are. I don't really want to go into too much detail because we don't want to make a how-to for how to do that, but it's pretty bad.
Yeah, there were really only 4 sandbox images that we were seeing repeatedly, and they were the same image just over and over and over again from many different places. It was fairly interesting. So our lessons learned were that most people are using those same sandbox images, and that AV thinks your file is malicious regardless of its capability. Our sensor didn't have any remote access capabilities. It did the same thing that a lot of JavaScript that's on web pages does, and we were marked as malicious, especially the more that they were shared. That seemed to be the key item that they were keying in on.
Also, if someone submits an adversary sample to a malware sandbox, they will be tipped off immediately. The other thing is you start to see how it propagates out to all these different security companies who are using pretty poor operational security, doing things directly from their network, directly connecting to the C2 servers from their network, directly doing DNS resolutions to that network. So it definitely tips off the adversary if a sample gets uploaded, just because of how widely spread it gets executed, how widely spread the traffic that gets generated from those systems gets spread and then resolved through DNS resolution systems, passive DNS systems, those sorts of things. So some of our samples that we submitted, I think about a month or 2 ago, the C2 domains are still being resolved today. So they're still looking them up. So it's a dead giveaway. So just something to be mindful of as you use these systems. It's basically tipping your hand. If this is a targeted attack, you're tipping your hand. Not only can they look and see is my file hash showing up on any of these free sites, they see the traffic immediately. So keep that in mind. Next, sandboxes can be fingerprinted basically trivially. Very, very simple techniques. You don't need anything advanced. Most of the advanced techniques that we saw were mainly about keying in on virtualization. So is this running in virtualization setting or not? That's not really needed to detect sandboxes. So it may or may not be virtualized, but it's likely going to have the same host name, very small disk size, very small RAM size, only one CPU. Most CPUs today have more than one core. So seeing one CPU along with the other features we mentioned is kind of anomalous for enterprise settings. All these very simple things can be used to kind of key in on that. And then lastly, you get what you pay for. These services are free. We don't mean to knock them in any way, but keep that in mind. As you give this data outbound, you lose complete control over it.
I also wanted to, we kind of stepped over a couple of things earlier. The sharing of the samples, how far they were shared. One of the sandboxes we submitted to, we saw more than 500, over a 2-week period, we saw more than 500 other client IPs hit our server, and more than 200 HTTP actual requests running our malware or our sensor to our C2 server. The other thing was, this was really easy to create. It took us less than 40 hours total to stand up the server, to put together the 2 different sensors, and to submit them to all these sandboxes. And the part of the experiment that took the longest was submitting them to all of the sandboxes. So, and that's all we actually had. This was much quicker than I thought it was going to be with 23 slides. Does anybody have any questions?
So, with all the findings, were you able to share that information with some of these, services?
Yeah, so we've been working with some of them. The question was, have we shared information back to the providers of the different sandboxes and such? We have with some of them, not with all of them.
How was, ratio as far as response?
A lot of it is just getting a hold of the right people.
So our plan is to disclose all of our findings in great detail to all these vendors. We just haven't had a chance to kind of fully finish that process. That's why we left a lot of detail out of the talk. So we didn't go into great detail on each sandbox provider. We really didn't want to create a how-to for how bad guys can do that sort of thing. But we're still kind of working through responsible disclosure. The question was, do we feel if our sample got shared with the dark side? It's possible if they're monitoring these sandboxes. A lot of these sandboxes allow you to download the files directly from them. They would really need to be looking for them, though. A lot of times, a lot of these places have millions of uploads per day, so it's kind of a sea of data. We definitely saw that some places are downloading all the malware from these sandboxes and executing every one of them. I would guess those are all AV companies, though, just based on the data we have.
What do you recommend that the sandbox vendors do to mitigate this threat?
So the question was, what do we recommend that the sandbox vendors do to mitigate the threat? I suppose to us, the biggest threat was more to the end users and the end organizations. So going into this, we kind of knew that people would share the samples and they would run them. We didn't quite know to the level of activity that we would see. That was kind of amazing. And additionally was like how regular the activity was. A couple companies hit us every hour on the hour. So that's kind of interesting to see. So our takeaway was that people that are responding to a targeted intrusion or what they think is a targeted intrusion, that it's in their best interest to actually run those things in a closed sandbox environment rather than on the open web. You can do that with Remnux, with FakeNet if you don't want to set up a separate Linux side, or with a lot of other tools as well. The sandbox providers themselves, there's a lot of work that they could do to improve their platforms. Maybe improve the disk sizes, improve the memory sizes and the RAM sizes. Those are all things that have been disclosed and talked about before. We just wanted to see how useful those things actually were. There's a lot of, and one of the things that came out like last week was samples of Upatre that were doing like a get tick count to see how long the host had been up, because I guess their assumption is that some sandboxes will just reset and restart the image each time with a short amount of time from boot to when it's run. But you could easily work through that by just starting up an image that's already been up for 30 minutes or something.
The only thing I would add to that is some of the free open source sandbox platforms, I think, could either help with either documentation or automation to change the configuration of the images. So images are going to be shared, that's a fact, but you could do stuff right before the malware executes, so change hostname, change the BIOS settings, change a bunch of features of the VM, or at least how the VM looks to the malware sample. Also not rename the sample before running. A bunch of different things that they could do, I think, to kind of help enable people who run these locally, because a lot of these same platforms are run locally by researchers. They're just as fingerprintable if you run locally. So I think those are things that could be done. Question?
Do you see any complete failures where they take their sample out of the sandbox?
Did we see any complete failures where someone took our sample and ran it not in a sandbox but in some sort of production environment? I don't think so. It might be hard for us to detect that, to be honest, but I don't think that happened.
Well, we could probably say that most likely did not happen, because all of the disks were like 20 gigs and 30 gigs in size. So.
What percentage of the providers actually try to call back?
What percentage of the providers actually try to call back in terms of?
Actually, let's track them.
Good question. I think, was it 8? I think 8 of them. I think only 8 of them allowed direct network connections back.
Yeah, so I guess 8 of them, is that 8 of the sandbox providers actually connected to us with the HTTP traffic. 22 of them made the DNS lookup out of 29. There were some places that made no connections whatsoever to our sites. That was interesting. A lot of the connections to our systems were made after they had been shared from that original provider out. And that was interesting. The only place most of the places that you select private on end up sharing those samples to other AV providers, which was an interesting finding of ours.
So seeing all of these callbacks from these different vendors gives me some ideas for my click business. But otherwise, did you actually take a look at their acceptable use policies and data sharing policies after you saw the propagation and sort of compare what you saw with what they may have stated as a policy?
Question was, did we look at the acceptable use policy and data sharing policies at these places after we saw how data propagated? We have not done that yet. That would definitely be interesting to see if there's conflict.
You plan on giving this talk next year, see how much they've changed everything?
I would like to continue this research, and I think there's a lot of other directions we can go with this. But yeah, I would like to do that.
Yeah, specifically around how the indicators ended up on threat indicator lists that were being deployed in people's production blocking scenarios. That's kind of the most interesting portion to us, at least, to me, at least. Yes.
What percentage of the DNS requests were bounced through Google DNS or DNS?
Oh yeah, so the most prevalent DNS servers were Google DNS, and the most prevalent HTTP servers, or HTTP clients, were Amazon Web Services. So a lot of people are running sandboxes on Amazon Web Services, and a lot of people are using Google DNS 8.8.8, and all of that comes back as Google Translate, and most frequently, at least, that we were seeing.
Now, did you say that at your company, Threat Street, they react at all?
Did we react at all?
Yeah, like, are there other folks in your company where they somehow detect it?
Oh, well, we would have been doing the detection. Although we did, we created the samples in such a way that we were actually specifically trying to trigger one of our colleagues' Yara roles that were up on VirusTotal. And that did succeed, and that was fun. He wasn't really happy with us after a couple of days and just kept sending messages back to us. Yeah. I guess what else? Is there anything else to say? Any other questions? No? Jeff?
So you said that it was detected by some of the AV as Zeus and one of the malware families?
Grafter, I guess.
Yeah. Was that intentional on your part?
No.
Any idea why it was detected that way?
So if we UPX packed them, they were almost always detected as Zeus amongst some AV vendors. But then some of the samples that weren't UPX packed were also detected as Zeus, and then they were detected as Grafter. I have no idea why they were. If anything, by using the, and you might remember this from, when you took my class, did we do the Chop Shop module in it? No? Okay. So the way that we did the HTTP communications, I was really curious to see, will any AV vendors use the network traffic to try to trigger off of that and classify the malware or the sample as something? And I was specifically using that to try to see if that would happen, and that didn't happen. So that was kind of interesting. Anybody else? Cool. Well, thank you. I guess you guys got enough.